She walked into the courtroom in silence, flanked by two officers who barely looked at her as they tightened the cuffs around her wrists. Her expression didn't change. No fear, no anger, no pleading. Just a calm, calculating focus in her eyes. The kind of look most people in that room had never seen before, and certainly didn't understand. The judge didn't bother glancing up as her file was dropped onto the bench. The bailiff smirked, and somewhere in the back, a reporter scribbled the words, "cold and expressionless," onto their notepad. To them, she was just another defendant. A woman in trouble. A headline in waiting. She didn't match the profile of anyone important. She didn't scream or protest. She didn't sob into the sleeve of her hoodie. She didn't even blink when the chains on her ankles clinked loudly across the floor. In their minds, that was all the proof they needed. Guilty. Or at least someone who had seen her fair share of bad decisions. The prosecutor glanced at her like he was looking at a menu. Dispassionate. Detached. Already preparing his opening argument in his head without once really seeing her. She was just another checkmark. Another case number. Another body moving through a system built to process people quickly, with as little effort as possible. She hadn't even spoken yet, but they thought they had her figured out. There were murmurs in the courtroom. Low whispers from the gallery, people nudging one another, speculating about her story. They pointed at the tattoos that peeked out from beneath the cuffs, at the scars along her forearms. They saw the short-cropped hair, the rigid posture, the way her eyes scanned every corner of the room, not nervously but tactically. Still, they chalked it all up to prison toughness or bad attitude. No one thought to ask where those scars came from, or what those tattoos meant, or why she stood like someone used to giving silent orders that saved lives. Her lawyer looked uncomfortable. Out of place. Like he knew something the rest of them didn't but wasn't quite sure how to say it out loud. He kept glancing at the paperwork in front of him, flipping back to the cover sheet. Something didn't add up. The charges, the timeline, the way the arrest had gone down, it didn't match her demeanor, her silence, her calm. But no one else cared. The machine of the courtroom was already turning, gears grinding forward, pressuring everyone to keep moving. Justice in name only. The officers who had transported her remained by the door, arms crossed, trying to look composed. But if you watched closely, one of them kept shifting his weight, glancing at her now and then. Not like a guard. Like a man who realized he might have made a mistake. Maybe it was something she said in the van. Maybe it was the way she sat during the ride, straight-backed and still, eyes closed like she was reviewing a mission in her head. Or maybe it was when he noticed the insignia on the dog tag she wore under her shirt, something he only caught a glimpse of when she leaned forward during the frisk. But no one in the courtroom noticed that. Not yet. They had already made up their minds. She was dangerous. She was cold. She was probably guilty. That's what they thought. That's what they needed to think. Because if they admitted that something didn't fit, if they paused long enough to truly look at her, they would have seen something else entirely. They would have seen that she wasn't fidgeting like the others waiting to be arraigned. She wasn't slouched or defiant or blank. She was reading every movement, measuring distance between her and the exit, counting the number of visible weapons, identifying the soft targets in the room without even looking directly at them. That wasn't fear. That wasn't nervousness. That was training. And training like that doesn't come from a bar fight or a stint in juvie or a couple of bad years on the street. But still, no questions. No curiosity, no respect, just the handcuffs, the smirks, and the assumption that she belonged there. Because when she was led into that courtroom, the arrest didn't shock anyone. Not yet. She stood before them like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. The murmurs had died down. The cuffs remained on her wrists, her ankles still chained to the bolt in the floor beneath the defense table. She didn't complain. She didn't speak. And still, no one in that courtroom gave her the dignity of eye contact. The judge glanced through a stack of cases like he was reviewing grocery receipts, then paused briefly to lift her file. His eyebrows twitched barely, but he said nothing. Whatever caught his eye, he buried beneath routine procedure. Across from her, the prosecutor finally rose. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and began with the same tired cadence he'd used dozens of times that week. He referred to her by her last name, not her full name. No miss, no Ms., no honorific. Just a case number attached to a few allegations on a charge sheet. He recited her supposed crimes with theatrical neutrality: trespassing, resisting arrest, possession of restricted equipment. Words that sounded official, serious, even damning until you looked past them. But no one did. The audience leaned in like they were watching a rerun of a courtroom drama. Reporters typed phrases like stoic and silent, already fitting her into the villain role before the evidence had been discussed. She still hadn't moved. Her posture remained impeccable, as if she was still in formation, waiting for a command. Her face gave nothing away. No guilt, no pride, no fear. The bailiff, meanwhile, kept a hand near his holster, a little too eager. He had been watching her from the moment she entered. She was the kind of defendant who made some officers nervous, not because she looked dangerous, but because she didn't. Because her calm felt earned. Because men like him couldn't explain what made her unsettling, so they told themselves she was just acting tough. Judgment hung thick in the room, and it had nothing to do with the judge's gavel. It was in every sideways glance, every shallow assumption, every smirk from someone who thought they had the upper hand. She was being judged not for what she had done, but for how she carried herself. For how she made them uncomfortable by refusing to shrink. The lawyer assigned to her shuffled through papers, unsure whether to speak or wait. He looked young. Nervous. Maybe this was his 5th or 6th case of the day. Maybe he had never defended anyone with her kind of presence. He opened his mouth twice before saying anything, stumbling through a few lines about her clean record, her complex background, and the questionable details of the arrest. But the courtroom wasn't listening. They'd already decided she was someone who had crossed a line. And once you're on the wrong side of that line, no one wants to know why. Her silence was interpreted as defiance. Her posture as arrogance. Her lack of visible fear made them more certain she was dangerous. If she had cried, begged, or looked shaken, perhaps they would have pitted her. But she didn't, and so they didn't. And still, no one asked what brought her to that courtroom. No one asked why someone trained to disappear into the harshest environments on Earth, someone whose file had redacted pages and references to covert operations, someone who had once pulled teammates from burning wreckage, was now sitting in chains like a petty thief. They didn't ask because they didn't care to look deeper. The system doesn't like nuance. It prefers a clean narrative. Good guys. Bad guys. Defendant. Accuser. If someone doesn't fit the script, they force them into the role anyway. The courtroom didn't want her story. They wanted her surrender. Her silence made her dangerous in their eyes. But the real danger was what her silence concealed. Her name hadn't been spoken yet. Not the full one. Not the name that had echoed through foreign fields, through radios on missions no one would ever admit happened. Not the name that made enemy combatants hesitate and friendlies stand taller. Just her last name, muttered with procedural disdain as though it carried no weight beyond a docket number. The prosecutor mentioned the military connection like it was a technicality, almost a footnote. He glossed over it, careful not to dig too deep. Because if he did, the room would have changed. The assumptions would have cracked. The story they were trying to tell wouldn't hold. But at that moment, none of them knew they were misjudging someone trained to move in silence, someone who'd spent years mastering the art of being overlooked until the moment she decided not to be. The moment her full name was spoken, it was like someone had cracked a window in a soundproof room. The air shifted just slightly at first, but enough for those who were paying attention to feel it. The prosecutor had been mid-sentence, reciting a timeline of events in a voice laced with practiced confidence. But when he read aloud the name on the official report, the courtroom stilled. Not dramatically. Not like in the movies. It was subtler than that. A hesitation in the judge's pen. A blink from the bailiff. A sudden silence in the gallery as heads turned, not toward the speaker, but toward her. The name hung there, suspended in the space between certainty and doubt. And for the first time since the hearing began, it wasn't just a case anymore. It was a question. One no one had thought to ask until now. Because that name, it wasn't ordinary. Not if you knew where to listen. Not if you had ever sat in a briefing room with blacked-out windows and names read from a secure file. Not if you had served. Especially not if you had served in that unit. A man in the back, a veteran who had come to court for an unrelated matter, straightened in his seat. He mouthed the name to himself. Then again, slower. You could see the moment recognition hit him. It was like someone had flipped a switch behind his eyes. His posture changed. Respect slipped into his expression. Not the cheap kind offered out of obligation, but the rare, hard-earned kind given only when it's truly deserved. At the defense table, her lawyer stopped speaking mid-sentence. His voice cracked. He stared down at the paperwork as if realizing only now who he was sitting next to. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted the file again, scanning the details he had missed before. And when he looked at her, it was different this time. Less like he was representing a client and more like he was sitting beside someone whose name carried weight far beyond this courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. He didn't say anything at first, but his eyes narrowed and he thumbed through the manila folder with sudden urgency. He flipped past the pages he'd skimmed earlier, reading line by line now, faster and faster until he hit the section that made his jaw go tight. A brief service record, highly redacted. Half the paragraphs blacked out. And one unredacted phrase near the bottom, Naval Special Warfare, SEAL Team, Designated Marksman. Then the courtroom shifted again. One of the officers near the wall stood up a little straighter. He looked over at her no longer with casual suspicion but with a trace of unease. Like he was realizing that the woman they had cuffed with a little too much force might have known exactly how to disarm them before they ever touched her. But she hadn't. She'd let it happen. Chosen silence. Endured judgment. Waited. Because people like her don't need to prove themselves. They are the proof. The bailiff, still standing stiffly by the bench, glanced down at his notes, then back at her. He swallowed. Something in him flickered. Was it guilt? Recognition? Or the creeping awareness that mocking her, even silently, had been a mistake? That he hadn't just underestimated a woman, he had disrespected someone with more battlefield experience than anyone else in the room combined. Still, she said nothing. Her breathing hadn't changed. Her posture remained rigid, unreadable. But something had shifted in her expression. Not arrogance. Not pride. Something quieter. Like the flicker of a candle in a locked room. She knew the weight of that name. Knew what it meant when it finally reached the ears of people who understood. Because the name wasn't just a name. It was a call sign whispered during rescue missions. It was listed on after-action reports that never reached the press. It belonged to someone who had been dispatched to places so dark the stories came back in rumors, not reports. She had earned that name in places no courtroom would ever see. With precision. With silence. With restraint. And now that name had finally caught up to her, not in warning, but in revelation. Long before the handcuffs, long before the courtroom whispers, she had lived a life few could imagine. Not a life captured in photos or paraded on social media, but one etched in sweat, discipline, and silence. A life carved out in deserts, jungles, oceans where her presence was never officially recorded but her impact always felt. The journey from battlefield to courtroom wasn't a fall from grace. It was a detour forged by systems that never knew how to hold space for someone like her. She hadn't joined the Navy to make headlines. She joined because it was the only place where silence wasn't seen as weakness, where precision mattered more than words, where loyalty wasn't talked about, it was lived. Every test she faced, she passed with a level of intensity that made instructors take note. Not because she was loud or defiant or eager to prove herself, but because she never backed down. Not once. Not even when the odds were designed to break her. Becoming a SEAL was more than a badge or a title. It was endurance through hell day after day. Freezing water that robbed you of your breath. Sand in your eyes, under your skin, in your lungs. Men dropping out around her, broken in body and spirit. But she remained. Quietly. Without complaint. When asked how she did it, she didn't give a speech, she just looked ahead and said there was no option to fail. As a sniper, she was a ghost. A presence no one saw coming until it was over. Her hands had steadied rifles during nights when even the moon was too afraid to shine. Her breath had slowed to near nothing while waiting hours, sometimes days, for the perfect moment. She wasn't just accurate. She was surgical. Measured. Lethal when necessary, but always restrained. Her targets were selected with care, her missions classified beyond the clearance of most who sat behind desks in Washington. And yet, despite the medals she never wore in public, the operations she never spoke of, and the brothers she'd carried through fire and fallout, her transition back to civilian life was not met with reverence. It was met with paperwork. With blank stares from VA clerks who didn't know what to do with her service record. With neighbors who asked if she was really in the military because she didn't look like it. With landlords who didn't understand why she woke at 4:30 a.m. to run drills. With a country that loved the idea of heroes until those heroes needed help. She tried to build a life outside the uniform. She tried to be normal. But when you've lived for so long in survival mode, normal feels like a lie. The quiet didn't comfort her. Taunted her. No battle plan. No objective. Just the hum of a refrigerator and the occasional flicker of a ceiling fan. Mocking reminders that she no longer had a place in the world she fought for. And still, she didn't complain. When she took a security contract overseas, it was out of necessity, not choice. She didn't want to be pulled back into that world. But bills don't care about trauma, and peace doesn't pay rent. It was during one of those assignments that something went wrong. Not on the mission, but back home. Property dispute. A confrontation with a developer. The kind of thing that spirals when people underestimate the wrong person. She returned stateside to find her home locked, her belongings tossed, and the legal system already in motion against her. When she pushed back, she did so within the rules. But those rules had loopholes. Power leaned toward money, and she had neither. Just her record, her instincts, and the quiet understanding that no one was going to fight for her. They charged her like she was reckless. Labeled her volatile. Said she was difficult to detain. But they left out the part where she had complied. Where she'd walked into the police station herself. Where the resistance they referred to was her asking to see a warrant. Where the restricted equipment was a tactical med kit still in her trunk. Standard issue from a recent trip overseas. The battlefield had taught her rules. Unspoken ones. Brotherhood, discipline, clarity of purpose. But this courtroom had none of those. It was a place where nuance was drowned out by bias, where her calm became suspicious, where her silence made her dangerous. And now they were looking at her through the lens of their own assumptions, unaware that her story wasn't one of rebellion, but of relentless service wrapped in a system that never understood what it took to survive both war and peace. The mistake wasn't in the arrest itself. It wasn't even in the way they handled her roughly without acknowledgement, as if she were a threat that needed containing. No, the real mistake came from the moment they looked at her and decided they already knew everything they needed to know. From the second they saw a woman in handcuffs and assumed she was someone beneath them. Someone who had lost control. Someone broken. The biggest mistake they made was judging her by what they could see without ever asking what had been hidden by design. It wasn't the first time. People had been misjudging her long before the courtroom. In training, some instructors thought she was in over her head until they watched her run drills faster, cleaner, and with more focus than most of the men around her. On missions, foreign operatives dismissed her as a translator or admin until they watched her shoot with such chilling accuracy that they stopped asking questions entirely. Even in airports, TSA agents looked at her sideways when she refused to be rattled by long lines and loud orders. But misjudging her didn't bother her. Not anymore. In some ways, it was a weapon. Underestimation gave her the upper hand until it didn't. Because here, in this courtroom, it wasn't just disrespect. It was dangerous. The prosecutor thought he had her pinned. He crafted his arguments with the confidence of someone who believed facts were fixed points. He pointed to photographs, to timestamps, to a blurred narrative stitched together by people who had never seen her at her best or at her worst. He emphasized her refusal to comply, her unregistered gear, the fact that she hadn't offered a statement. He believed silence was guilt, that her stillness was a sign of cornered defiance. But what he didn't understand was that she had spent years learning how to say nothing, how to keep secrets that could alter global events, how to carry trauma in her bones without leaking it into every conversation, how to sit through debriefs where the only thing she could say was no comment. Her silence wasn't new. It was standard. It was discipline. It was strategy. So while he spoke, she listened not to his words but to his tone. The cadence of a man convinced he'd already won. He referred to her as the defendant so many times he forgot she had a name. But others in the room hadn't. One by one, the pieces were clicking into place. People were whispering her name now, not like gossip, but like memory. Like reverence. Like the realization that the person in front of them wasn't a headline, but a legend. The judge, too, had begun to shift. His glances at her grew longer, more measured. He was rereading the file as though he had missed something because he had. There were service commendations buried between redactions. Operation names no civilian would recognize. And a detail that stood out bold in its simplicity, highest-rated marksman in her unit's history. It was becoming harder to maintain the illusion. The illusion that she was simply another angry woman who had let a confrontation escalate. The courtroom's earlier certainty was thinning. It was in the way the gallery grew quiet when her background was mentioned, and how the bailiff had stopped smirking. In the prosecutor's brief stammer when he mispronounced the name of the base where she'd been stationed, exposing that he had done only a surface-level read of who she was. The mistake was never hers. She had followed orders even when they didn't make sense. She had stayed within boundaries, even when provoked. She had kept herself in check, even when others treated her like a threat. But their mistake, judging her by appearance, by silence, by misunderstanding, was beginning to backfire. Because once people knew who she really was, their questions changed. They wondered why she had been cuffed in the first place, why her gear was considered suspicious, why she hadn't been granted immediate release the moment her credentials were confirmed. And slowly, the room started to understand. They hadn't just misread her. They had exposed their own assumptions, their own fear of someone who didn't match the image of a hero, someone whose strength wasn't loud or performative, but built through precision, sacrifice, and the unbearable weight of never being allowed to explain herself. Their mistake wasn't treating her like a criminal. It was believing they had the right to decide what strength should look like. The room wasn't quiet out of respect, it was quiet because they didn't know what to say anymore. Every assumption had been peeled away, layer by layer, until all that remained was the uncomfortable truth. They hadn't seen her for who she was. Not even close. They saw a woman in chains and decided she was a problem. But they never stopped to consider how she had carried herself with more control, more discipline, and more restraint than any of them had shown her. Honor isn't loud. It doesn't demand applause or recognition. It sits steady in the chest of those who've endured what most people can't begin to imagine. And for her, it wasn't just a word, it was the code she had lived by when no one was watching. In war zones, in safe houses, in chaotic moments where seconds meant lives, she held the line. And she had done so without needing the world's approval. But when she returned home, she discovered that the country she served didn't know how to honor quiet strength. It didn't recognize the kind of courage that walks into a courtroom alone, hands cuffed, head held high, with no one to vouch for her. Identity for her wasn't defined by uniforms or medals. Those were just byproducts of the mission. Her real identity was built in the silence between orders, in the long waits, in the split-second decisions that changed everything. It was built in the way she stayed composed when her team panicked, in the way she put herself in harm's way because someone had to. And yet here she was, stripped of everything that once made people salute her, being looked at like a threat instead of the protector she had always been. The courtroom didn't know what to do with that kind of identity. They tried to flatten her into a stereotype, angry veteran, volatile woman, stubborn defendant. But none of it fit, because she didn't play into their expectations. She didn't yell. She didn't break. She didn't justify herself to people who had already decided not to listen. And in a system that feeds off confession and submission, her quiet defiance was unnerving. They expected her to fight back, and when she didn't, they assumed guilt. But it wasn't guilt they were seeing, it was clarity. She knew who she was. She knew what she had survived. And most importantly, she knew that nothing they said in that courtroom could change the truth she carried inside her. They could try to rewrite her story, but they didn't live it. They didn't bleed for it. They didn't bury teammates, carry trauma, or spend sleepless nights wondering if she had done enough. That was hers alone. The price of assumptions was now clear. The judge's tone had softened. The prosecutor had grown less certain, his language suddenly more cautious. The gallery, once full of judgmental curiosity, now sat in uneasy reflection. And as for the bailiff, he no longer stood tall. He looked at her differently now, like a man beginning to understand the gravity of his mistake. The gravity of misjudging someone who had been trained to remain calm under fire, who had once taken life and death orders from generals now watching silently from shadows. What they all failed to see was that restraint isn't weakness. That silence isn't surrender. That a person who doesn't yell, doesn't flinch, doesn't react on cue isn't passive, they're powerful. Especially when that person has been through more in a single deployment than most people experience in a lifetime. They had expected her to be broken. But what they got instead was unshaken resolve. She didn't belong to the courtroom. She belonged to a code they couldn't interpret, one written in scars and sacrifice, in loyalty and long nights filled with ghosts she would never name. They judged her because they were uncomfortable with what they didn't understand. And that discomfort exposed more about them than it ever did about her. They had been looking at the wrong things. Watching for guilt in the way she breathed. Watching for lies in the way she blinked. But what they missed was the truth, steady, unwavering, written in the way she carried herself even while shackled. The truth that this was never about rebellion or aggression or a refusal to comply. It was about someone who had spent her entire life protecting others only to be betrayed by the very structure she had once sworn to defend.